Das M100.
The M100.
Das Forum, das Kolloquium.
I'm very pleased to be at the M100 SANSSOUCI.
Mir eröffnet M100 jedes Mal eine ganze Fülle von neuen Perspektiven.
It's a sort of perspective that you don't always get. One of the best things about the M100 is the other people that you meet here. I mean, it's just remarkable and a very rare gathering of people.
It's people that come from very different areas of societies.
With journalists from so many different countries.
Journalisten aus wirklich allen europäischen Ländern, und zwar über die Europäische Union hinaus.
For media people to get together and talk makes a lot more sense than for politicians meeting in Brussels, Strasbourg, or anywhere else.
I've been really impressed with the range of the diversity of the views.
Very lively debate about the future of Europe, the way media cover all this crisis.
All the more reason to get thoughtful people working in different areas related to this to come and talk about these issues.
Is there one view about that? Should there be one view about that? And I think all of the different countries that make up this continent, will have their own view. And is it necessary for them to have one single view about the way forward? It's a big question.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2021 M100 SANSSOUCI Colloquium and the subsequent M100 Media Award. I'm Aslan, international TV host and journalist, and I've had the pleasure and privilege to be part of the M100 conference for many, many years. And I can tell you it's wonderful to be back in person here in Potsdam in front of a live audience. But of course, welcome to everyone joining us online as well. This year's M100 is under the title and theme From Crisis in Perpetuity to Democratic Resilience. And democratic resilience is something that we all need here in Germany, in Europe, in the US, all across the world. We will have a fantastic panel here later on stage with wonderful panelists and, of course, the traditional privileged M100 Media Award, ladies and gentlemen. Much to be discussed, of course, but to kick off this year's M100 conference, it's my great pleasure for the opening speech to welcome here up on stage the award-winning author and professor of social theory and cultural sociology at Humboldt University in Berlin. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Dr. Andreas Reckwitz.
The audience. When trying to draw conclusions from the COVID-19 crisis for the future, resilience has appeared as a key term of public debate. It could indeed become a crucial concept for the post-COVID-19 era or even for 21st century politics as a whole. For it appears to literally impose itself on us if we try to derive a reasonable lesson from the handling of the pandemic. Societies must become more resilient. Individuals should work on their mind and psychic structure to gain resilience, and the state should provide a framework for society to do so. Resilience is generally about the ability to be prepared for undesirable, even shocking events. The idea is that these events are stressful and charging, but the aim must be not to break down under their load. What seems necessary is a flexibility of behavior in order to survive without existential damage. The motto of resilience seems to be, talking with the German philosopher Nietzsche, what doesn't kill the individual or society makes it only stronger. Now, in the past decade, the pandemic has not been the only test to social adaptability. Rather, Western societies have repeatedly been confronted with crises that have put their resilience to the test. The financial crisis, the migration crisis, repeated terrorist attacks, and, as a permanent stressor, the climate crisis. However, when it comes to resilience, not sociologists or politicians, but psychologists have led the way up to now. Since the 2000s, therapy and counseling have discovered resilience as a key concept for long-term crisis prevention, for example, in the face of burnout syndromes. So resilience is a hot but also contested topic, a central term concerning new forms of steering, governance and self-government in late modernity. It is therefore worth taking a closer look. What is important from my point of view is that the term refers to an elementary change in perspective. In some respects, the idea of resilience even shakes up the modern understanding of progress. It replaces a policy of positivity with a policy of negativity. So an offensive strategy of increasing possibilities here is supplanted by a skeptical strategy of risk absorption. Now, there is no doubt that in some respects this seems promising. At the same time, however, the ambition to pursue resilience contains some problematic presuppositions of which we should be aware. My talk is above all on these problematic side effects of resilience in late modern society. Let's begin with the history of the concept. The term resilience originally comes from physics, or more precisely from material science. It refers to the property of a body to return to its initial state undamaged after a deformation. In a sense, the external disturbance bounces off the body. You punch the ball, it gives way, but in the end it has not lost any of its spherical shape. Psychology has adopted this idea since the 1950s. Initially, it was developed in the psychology of children and youth and was about explaining why in their early development some young persons cope better with psychological trauma than others. However, resilience has quickly turned from a notion of psychological diagnosis into one of therapy. In order to prevent exhaustion disorders, for example, it is now taken to be an important goal to systematically train oneself in resilience. The regulation of one's own negative emotions seems as a first basic requirement for a resilient life. A second condition is self-efficacy, in German Selbstwirksamkeit, that is to say, everyday training in overcoming one's own sense of powerlessness. Now, psychology itself is a social phenomenon. The way it thinks about individuals reveals something crucial about the values and problems of society as a whole. From this point of view, the career of resilience in the last decade is remarkable. For initially, from the 1960s onwards, the so-called positive psychology was the guiding force in therapy. That is, a school of thought centered on visions of self-development and self-growth. A psychology whose ideal is an individual who leaves constraints behind, tries things out with relish, and realizes his or her potential. Positive psychology is centered on the expansion of individual possibilities for a satisfactory life. In contrast, the starting point of resilient psychology is much more skeptical. Now it says one must inevitably reckon with negative events in one's life, with shocks and catastrophes that threaten to throw the individual off balance. Resilience training is ultimately about strategies that disturbances don't turn into trauma. It is about a survival training for the individual. Policymakers have not yet paid such close attention to resilience issues as psychologists have, but they are rapidly catching up. What would a politics of resilience look like? That is to say, a politics the aim of which is to strengthen the resilience of society. Crucially, such a politics implies a fundamentally different perspective on society than do classical forms of governance. Here, too, the goals are reversed, from striving for the new and positive to avoiding or enduring the negative. From the point of view of resilience, society appears less as a space for departure into a progressive future than as being in a state of elementary vulnerability. The task now is to prevent the worst. It should be emphasized, a state that is primarily oriented towards resilience would differ fundamentally from those models of governance that have dominated Western countries since 1945. Historically, there have been two main types of government here: the welfare state of the 1950s to 70s and the competitive state since the 1980s. The welfare state model sets itself the goal to build social security, avoid economic imbalances, and create equal living conditions for all. The competitive state model aimed to increase competitiveness in a globalized world and personal responsibility in society. Both models of the state are different, but they share the perspective of classical modernity, and its guiding principle is progress. This idea of politics takes as point of departure a certain pattern of temporality, namely the expectation of a better future. The future appears here as a space for the development of positive opportunities. It is open and it must be conquered for social improvements in the direction of freedom, equality, innovation, emancipation, etc. This was the credo of the Enlightenment, and it has been deeply anchored in the self-understanding of modern politics. However, if resilience is now emerging as a new guiding principle for politics, this means a reversal of perspective. The future now appears as a space of risks to which society is exposed. Positive expectations and the belief in feasibility are replaced by a normalization of negative expectations for the future. Society now appears as a system that is repeatedly exposed to violent disturbances. These threaten the social equilibrium. The basic assumption of the politics of resilience was developed by Ulrich Beck as early as in his 1986 book, Risk Society. Society would endanger itself in unpredictable ways, be it through ecological catastrophes such as climate change, through diseases that spread epidemically at breakneck speed with globalization, or through financial crises or terrorist attacks. A politics of resilience is thus a politics of the negative with a long-term perspective. It learns from ever new crises and catastrophes by trying to prepare society for the worst. Resilience thus forms the center of a whole conceptual field of skeptical politics in which prevention and security play a central role. The future now appears fundamentally uncertain, while resilience measures are supposed to increase the degree of security. In this context, resilience and prevention often go hand in hand. While resilience creates precautions so that negative events that do occur are absorbed, prevention attempts to create precautions so that these events occur as rarely as possible. What are possible actions and procedures of a politics of resilience? It is difficult to give a general answer to this question, as different concrete policies are involved depending on the problem area in question. Just to give some examples, a well-organized public health system is certainly a key resilience measure, not only to contain future pandemics. A reliable digital infrastructure facilitates societal coordination under time pressure in the event of a disaster. In the face of climate change, a country like the Netherlands can gain resilience by relocating populations from areas that are below sea level. Functioning and competent security bodies are certainly essential in the event of a possible terrorist attack. However, the problem with social risks is that it is impossible to foresee in which field they will next turn into a concrete threat. We are now reasonably sensitized to climate change and pandemics, but could the next thing that happens to be a digital super crash of the kind we have only seen in science fiction films? And are we prepared for it? Generally, one must stress the realm of risk holds a lot of unknown unknowns. For resilience policy, something akin to a broad-spectrum antibiotic in medicine would be desirable. Measures that are potentially effective against a wide range of threats. By the way, this is also the secret of psychological resilience training. For the individual does not know where the next severe problem will come from his or her life. Work, partnership, family, illness, but practicing certain psychological cross-section competences, such as emotional regulations, ideally arms the individual for the most diverse eventualities. What would be the counterpart to this on a social level? What would be a broadband antibiotic for politics of resilience? Two cross-section characteristics appear central here: social trust and the ability to cooperate. Societies emerge better from crisis when there is broad public trust in the reliability and fairness of institutions, and when people are able to cooperate politically across camp boundaries. Trust and the ability to cooperate would be fundamental features of a resilient society, but what is difficult about them is that they elude short-term political intervention. They can only grow over a prolonged period of time. The politics of resilience therefore rests in decisive ways on pre-political pillars. There is no doubt that a paradigm shift towards a politics of resilience in the 21st century in some respect would be a smart or even wise move. Instead of always rushing after the latest catastrophes in the short term, one has to acknowledge the ubiquity of risks from which to develop appropriate long-term strategies. Instead of following unrealistic visions of the future, it is necessary to reckon with the losses. Nevertheless, the problems of such skeptical politics should not be overlooked. Four such problems impose themselves, and I would like to look at them a bit more in detail. First, resilience building blends into the seemingly inevitable. The crises and catastrophes will happen anyway. We have to prepare for them. Resilience, therefore, reckons with unavailabilities or uncontrollabilities, with Unverfügbarkeit, to use a German term which can hardly be translated. On the one hand, this is a sensible revision of classic modern thinking about feasibility. It is true that individuals and societies must learn that they are unable to control their future completely, and many processes happen which are not planned and to which one can only react. On the other hand, such a defensive strategy can turn into defeatism. Is it really necessary to adapt to every external disturbance, or is it not possible to redesign conditions in such a way that the disturbance does not occur in the first place? Of course, society should build resilience to terrorist attacks, for instance, but this should not inhibit the attempt to dry up the terrorist milieus themselves. Of course, it is wise to take precautions against the consequences of climate change, such as heat waves or extreme weather, for example, but this certainly does not make politics which tackles climate change as its roots superfluous. Thus, in resilience, there is a tendency to depower strategies of change by focusing rather on mere strategies of adaptation. A second problem of a politics of resilience is that by focusing on possible disasters, it may create security fantasies, which can become established within the state and in the minds of the population, dreaming of comprehensive immunization against all negative events. Such an extreme position may arise in particular if resilience and prevention are closely linked and the perception of omnipresent risks leads to an ever-decreasing tolerance of risk. At the level of statehood, there is a fine line between prevention regimes and a high security policy that permanently restricts civil rights in favor of risk minimization. This is equally true with dealing with pandemics, climate change, or terrorism. To avoid such a fixation, the insight into the risk of negative events would have to lead to a more balanced risk awareness. It is necessary to accept that social risks cannot be reduced to zero. In a way, an intelligent politics of risks could even emancipate itself from a strict regime of prevention. Then it is easier to accept certain risks as one is prepared also to negative events. Third, resilience means that individuals and societies gain in robustness. The ideal is the ball that remains unscathed even after hitting it repeatedly. Of course, at first glance, this sounds like an uncontroversial goal. Societies that emerge unscathed from the COVID-19 pandemic would be enviable. In closer inspection, however, one will conclude that robustness is not everything. This is the third problem. We know Bert Brecht's story of Herr Keuner. A man who had not seen Mr. K, Herr Keuner, for a long time greeted him with the words, "You haven't changed at all." "Oh," said Mr. K, and turned pale. This means robustness and resilience also mean getting no chance to transform at all. On the contrary, crisis forces transformational possibilities upon individuals and societies. This does not mean to point to the somewhat shallow advice that crisis is a chance. Societies would surely prefer to avoid pandemics and their deaths, but if such a crisis occurs, there is the chance that it changes structures for the better. If one does not allow them to do so, for instance, as a result of extreme robustness, the damage may follow post-traumatically, with a time delay, but all the more violently. In general, negative events often mean loss and the experience of loss. A resilient person or society may try to quickly return to business as usual after the suffering of losses. However, it may be wiser to integrate the experience of loss into the present and modify one's behavior according to the future. The COVID-19 crisis, for example, brutally confronts Western, relatively old societies with the fragility of their older populations in particular, or even with the question of which elements of one's lifestyles are essential and which are dispensable. We do not yet know which consequences Western culture will draw from this, but ideally, resilience would be balanced against a sensitiveness that allows individuals and society to self-transform. For Nietzsche's ideal of resilience, that which does not kill me makes me stronger, also proves to be an ideal of rigidity and entrenchment that lacks the actual strength of individuals and groups to deal sensitively with losses. The fourth and final problem, so I come to the end of my talk, that resilience raises concerns the blind spot of a politics of the negative. Can a modern society afford to not formulate positive goals and rather concentrate exclusively on dealing with inevitable catastrophes? Can it manage without the visions of progress or at least improvement? This is not merely a theoretical question. The sequence of diverse crises over the past decade has repeatedly put Western politics into a crisis mode that is becoming no longer the exception, but the norm. Crises such as the financial or COVID-19 crises tie up considerable amounts of political energy over a period of years so that other long-term concerns and long-term aims can be lost from view. This is matched by social alarmism, with the media constantly pouncing on supposedly new or old moments of crisis. Resilience as a goal would fit well into this crisis mode. The problem is, however, that in this way negative expectations are normalized and attention is focused on dealing with short-term real or potential evils, leading to a sort of social stagnation. Certainly, the classically modern norm of progress and the belief that society can be planned on the drawing board deserve skepticism. But to shift completely from the politics of the positive to the politics of the negative seems like an unnecessary reduction of possibilities. Here too, the parallel with psychology can help. That individuals should be made crisis-proof with the help of resilience training is only realistic. But to bury positive psychology's hope for self-development and self-growth under the ubiquity of survival training would be to sacrifice any further ambition on the altar of security. This can be applied to societies. We can use the metaphor of a leg to stand on and a leg to play here, in German, Standbein and Spielbein. Resilience and prevention policies can target a necessary infrastructure of security, and in this respect provide a leg to stand on, without which societies risk becoming unbalanced. But this is not an end in itself. It could and should provide room for a free leg to play on. A politics beyond risk minimization, a politics of positive goals, of societal improvement, whether in the direction of autonomy, prosperity, social justice, or sustainability. Debating these is the real task of the political in the modern age, and society's interest in protection and precaution should not render this concern invisible. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Reckwitz, for kicking off this year's M100 with such thoughtful remarks, such timely remarks. M100 is, of course, first and foremost a European conference. You said societies have to become more resilient, and you've already pointed out the strings of crises these continents has gone through over the past decade, from the financial crisis, migration crisis, Brexit, now, of course, the pandemic. From your point of view, how resilient is Europe?
Well, I would say that, of course, I'm not against this aim of resilience. Quite on the contrary. Just as I said, I think resilience can be a certain kind of can be a basis of politics, but it shouldn't be the last end. This is what I argued. But of course, the question how resilient is Europe is very reasonable, and I think the resilience could still be increased. And we see that in COVID-19 crisis very dramatically, that the resilience is not up to date, and this is the reason why we discuss this topic. For example, concerning health systems or concerning digital infrastructure and so on. These could all be instruments of resilience, and obviously they are not perfect. And the other point, what I pointed out is, well, these very broad structures in society which could enable resilience. I said it is trust in institutions and the ability to cooperate, also crossing political aisles. And I think concerning these broad structures, there are differences between different European countries. For example, in Scandinavia, we see that the trust in the institutions is bigger as it is in France, for example. And this has its consequences also in the COVID-19 crisis.
And you've pointed out, of course, the need to strengthen institutions and how it varies from European country to European country. This M100 is, of course, first and foremost, one of the most prominent media conferences all across this continent. This room is filled with prestigious, experienced journalists. What role does media play in making societies more resilient?
That's a difficult question indeed, as sometimes I have the impression that media reduce resilience of society, as well, there is always the danger of this, what I call social alarmism. Yeah? Social alarmism, that we jump from crisis to crisis to crisis, and very short-term crisis. And media, of course, they report on these crises and they evaluate the crisis. There is as they are, of course, interested. That's the structure of mass media. They are interested in the new event, and above all, also the new negative events. And this is I think we cannot complain about media, as this is the structure of how mass media work. But this could be, could be a certain danger also for resilience. For example, for the trust in institutions, or for the ability of social cooperation. And the media, they are not an easy instrument in this context.
But if I understand you correctly, you're saying the structure of the business, so to speak, the emphasis on the negative is actually eroding the resilience within a society. Would that be too much of an argument?
No, I would say politics or resilience means you are focused on the negative, on what can happen negatively, and then you have to work on your resilience, which in a way is clever and smart. But if we stick to this, I would say this is not enough. Yeah? A society which is only, well, we are not so far yet, but it could be the case in 10 years. It's a society which is only focused on its resilience, and this is the first and foremost aim of it, to be resilient against terrorist attacks, against pandemics, and so against climate crisis. This could be a very poor society in a way, not economically, but as you don't have any positive aims anymore, like autonomy and prosperity and so on.
And before we let you go, again, this room is filled with great examples of great journalism, of very experienced individuals in the profession. I won't say recommendation, but what wish would you express direct towards them in making societies more resilient?
Well, as a sociologist, I'm always a bit cautious in making wishes, and above all, not in the face of journalism or media. But well, maybe the advice would be to see that. Well, this is a point I only came to relatively shortly, that this idea of trust in society and also this ideal of social cooperation crossing political aisles is a very fragile structure. And we should be aware of this fragility, and also media should be aware of this fragility, and we should rather try to strengthen that and not to undermine it.
I think that's a point very well taken and will be discussed throughout this evening. Professor Dr. Andreas Reckwitz, everyone, thank you so much for your remarks. Thank you very much. Well, fragility is indeed a good word to pass on now to the next highlight of this year's M100, the special talk, of course, titled The Totalitarian Temptations. In this talk, we will discuss the state of democracy and the reasons for the rise in authoritarianism that we are seeing all across the globe, even here on this continent. And I'm delighted to be joined here on stage by three individuals who are at the forefront of this debate. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome here up first on stage, you know him all, a very prominent Turkish journalist and the editor-in-chief of the independent news organization Özgurüz. Please welcome Can Dündar. Delighted and very pleased that we will be joined by the head of the International Security Division at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Claudia is here, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm particularly pleased to be joined here up on stage by someone who's very much himself in the news these days. He's the most prominent Afghan media entrepreneur and the co-founder and chairman of the MOBY group, which is the foremost, the most important media group and media outlet in Afghanistan, a country that's very much on our minds and in the headlines. Delighted to welcome him here in Potsdam. Saad Mohseni is here, ladies and gentlemen. Saad, wonderful to have you with us. Let's dive right in. The totalitarian temptation is the talk, is the subject of our talk. So let me start with you for the obvious reasons. Afghanistan has been dominating the headlines for weeks and months now. A dramatic turn of events in your country that is so dearly to you and which you have shaped as a media entrepreneur in a very prominent, very shaping manner. What we're seeing is the conquest of the Taliban and perhaps the erosion, the reversal of the progress that Afghan society has made for the past 2 decades. When was the last time you were in Afghanistan?
Late July.
Late July, so before
2 weeks before the collapse of the state.
What are you hearing from your sources, from your friends, from your family? What is the situation?
Well, we have 400 employees, and we still operate inside of Afghanistan. It's strange. It's strange in the sense that the environment is very different to the mid-1990s, because Afghanistan has changed since then. So while you have this dictatorial regime that's beginning to find its way, but at the same time you have women protesting on the streets of Kabul, or you have civil society activists launching all sorts of campaigns for education for girls, or you have the Taliban spokesperson on television debating an issue with a woman or with a civil society member. So it's a weird environment, and if things stand as they are today, in 12 months, I would see it as a success. But my only concern is that the environment's going to become a lot more restrictive. But this 20 years has allowed Afghanistan, this period of relative stability has really allowed Afghanistan to change in ways that was unimaginable. It's transformed an entire generation. And I think, yes, I think we can regress and we can go back, but much of what we have in terms of better education levels and literacy rates are up and people are living longer, you can't put that genie back in the bottle.
And just quickly before we move on, so your media group, your TV network, your journalism is still in existence. You are unhindered in your operation on the ground.
It's a little bit more challenging, but everything that we need to discuss, we discuss and we air. So if you watch the news bulletins, you'd be very surprised.
All right,
for now.
For now.
For now.
For now. Claudia Major, I remember, and that dates me, when Francis Fukuyama wrote his famous book, The End of History After the Cold War, implying that communism, totalitarianism is all but defeated. Now this is the success of Western values, of democracy, and it is here to stay. Now, 2021, we're seeing an erosion of democracy, as a matter of fact, even within our own continent. We don't have to look too far. We're in Potsdam today. We have to look towards Poland. We look towards Hungary, where illiberal democracies are very much in existence. How do you explain this? How do you explain why has democracy lost its allure in the past 2 decades?
That's probably the $1 million question. And the other $1 billion question is how we get it back. What I find interesting is, to a certain extent, what we can see on the national level, be it in Afghanistan and Turkey or in European countries. So this kind of temptation to kind of slowly cut democracy down, but do it in a very kind of subtle way. What we could see during the Cold War, we had this kind of clear-cut putsches or revolutions. And then, chaka, everybody saw you have tanks on the street, and now you have the end of democracy, and you have an authoritarian or totalitarian state. And what you could actually observe since the end of the Cold War, also in Europe, was this kind of slow, tiny, subtle backsliding. So not a kind of big bang, we stop it, but this kind of, under democratic cover, slowly cutting the democratic institutions, rights, and freedoms back. And that makes it so difficult. And I think this is one of the reasons why we could observe it also in Europe, also in the European Union, which insists so much on its democratic and normative values. Because it's not this kind of big bang change, but it is this kind of democratically hidden, cutting down the right of the media, the independent legal systems, the freedom of culture and education. And you don't really see when the things changed. And at some point you just realize, oh, that's not longer a democratic state because the freedom of press, of education, of our legal system is not longer there. And this makes it, particularly in Europe, if I look to countries like Poland or Hungary, so enormously difficult. But if I would add, I would say we can see this development on the level of the countries, but we can also see it on the international level, on which kind of I'm very much interested, because you can see this questioning of a rule-based liberal order Although, if you look, for example, to the United Nations, or how countries behave on the international scene. Remember the annexation of Crimea in 2014 by Russia. This is not only ignoring, it's breaking, it's totally abandoning international law. We can see it with the demise of international arms control treaties, with the building of new weapons. So we have this abandoning of a legal, democratic order which we had on the state level, also on the international level. And what we see increasingly is a return of power politics, of real, who has the power can decide. And that's, I think we will come back to that, that's a very worrying development on all levels.
No doubt, the return of power politics, John Dündar. As a matter of fact, you mentioned Crimea, we see it in Belarus these days as well. Europe, the West, in quotation mark, pretty much impotent in light of these aggressions. Globalization, John Dündar, hasn't really led to the spread of democracy as we had foreseen, right? As Francis Fukuyama, as Joseph Nye. So all these great minds had predicted. How do you explain this?
They were wrong. Yeah, I guess, I mean, they made a mistake understanding the world, and especially Middle East. They couldn't foresee it. And look at last 40 years. United States and European countries made a lot of mistakes in dealing with the Middle East. First, United States wants to stop communism, stop Russian involvement in Afghanistan, for example. Late 19s, when you look at the late 19s, they were trying to create a barrier in front of Soviet republics, and what they saw was they saw the world as, okay, from Greece to China there are lots of Muslim countries, so let's use Islam against communism. That was the first mistake, and they supported the Islamists there, starting from Afghanistan through all the Middle Eastern countries, and they created Al-Qaeda, right? And then in 20 years, okay, they realized that, okay, communism is over, but look at this, now we have Islam. What shall we do with it? Then the second mistake came, and they said, okay, let's try to use moderate Islam instead of radical Islam. This was another mistake. I mean, they supported, for example, leaders like Erdogan to prevent radical Islam. And in fact, there was no such a big difference between radicals and moderates in Islam when it comes to Islam. But they didn't even think about supporting liberals or secular forces in those countries, democratic forces. And another 20 years passed, and then came the refugee crisis, and Europe had no other chance than supporting the leaders like Erdogan, paying them to stop the refugee flow to Europe and turn a blind eye to their aggressive policies.
But if I understand it correctly, John, you're saying that the West, in that Europe and the US, were insincere in their remarks, in their intent to, quote-unquote, spread democracy. It was purely out of self-interest that they supported one group over the other. Is that my understanding?
Yeah, exactly. When it comes to their political interests, they were so ready to sacrifice their democratic principles, I'm afraid.
Claudia, do you want to respond directly to what John Dündar is saying?
I think I would totally agree on some actors. I think given that we speak in Germany, I think I would take it's maybe a bit more complex if you think about Germany. And I think that this kind of democratic backsliding or authoritarian, totalitarian questions, or recognizing that the idea of changing other countries didn't work is maybe a particularly painful learning process for Germany. In the way that Germany, after the end of the Cold War, somehow thought we are on the good side of the history because we won somehow against Russia, Soviet Union, Eastern Germany, we unified it. So this somehow shows that the liberal world is winning. And from there came this kind of convergence theory. If we only work closely enough with other countries, they will become like us. If we work in a modernization ship with Russia, they will become an economically liberal and democratic country. It didn't work. The same idea was applied to China. So if we only work closely enough, they will become like us, because obviously this is the right way of doing things. And the wake-up call for Russia was, the latest wake-up call was Crimea 2014, the war in the Donbass, and then the activities in Syria and all that. And the wake-up call with China was a bit more recent. But I think recognizing that something, that a kind of approach to foreign policy or to international politics in which Germany deeply believed, if we cooperate, liberal democracies will prevail because this is simply the better system. Accepting that this didn't work, what worked for us, leading to the unification of Germany, doesn't work in the world, is, I think, something that was very difficult to recognize. If you look at the German history, Germany, Western Germany, was the perfect example of successful state building after the Second World War. For 40 years, other countries helped us become a functioning democratic state. So the conviction was what worked for us should work for others, and that it didn't work is probably one of the most painful and frustrating and depressive lessons we learned from many engagements up until Afghanistan.
Indeed, Saad. Germany is a good example of where nation building works, as Claudia Major. Afghanistan these days, not so much. I mean, this is the question right now with the withdrawal of the US and the West. Does nation building work? In Afghanistan case, what's your verdict?
Well, I would like to differentiate between state building and nation building. Afghanistan has existed as a nation for almost 300 years. No one wants to secede. We feel comfortable being Afghans. State building, totally different thing. Someone pointed out to me that 20 years after entering Korea, the Americans, 20 years later, they had a dictatorship, and Korea was poorer than most African countries. It takes time. In Afghanistan, we've had many challenges, corruption being one, ineptitude, the great divide between the haves and the have-nots, the rural-urban divide. We had everything thrown in, basically. It was pretty much on steroids. And the reason why a lot of people didn't support the state eventually was because they felt that they could not deliver, in particular with corruption. And I think that there's always this temptation, whether it's in Eastern Europe or in Africa or in Asia, that a dictatorial regime, like the one we're seeing in China, could deliver on the basics. And I think this frustration in a place like Afghanistan, you know, we have the youngest population outside of sub-Saharan Africa, median age of 18. 65% of the population is under 20. We need to grow our economy at 12 or 15% for the next decade to just get out of poverty. So a lot of people feel this frustration, and of course, you know, every single day. I mean, of course, one of the benefits of a democracy is that there's free press, and we'd have exposés on a daily basis on officials and how much money they were making and their vehicles and their houses and everything else. And that frustration, of course, democracy sometimes can actually undermine democratic states. And in essence, we did that. But a lot of the values that we cherish are shared values. They're international, you know, they're universal values. Freedom of expression, for example, or basic rights. They're not necessarily Western values. So I think the lessons from Afghanistan is that, firstly, it takes time. Secondly, you really need an educated class for democracy to work. It's not about elections, it's about civil society, it's about higher education levels, it's women's rights, free expression, of course. And at the same time, the sponsors of this democratic process also cannot be enablers for corrupt officials. They cannot barge into people's homes and kill them. They cannot send people to an island off Cuba. I mean, a whole bunch of things need to happen for this exercise to succeed. I don't think we should necessarily give up on helping countries develop into democratic states, but I think we need to take some lessons, hard lessons from the Afghan experience.
Many lessons to be learned for sure after the current events in Afghanistan and what preceded it 20 years ago. John Dündar, the press of freedom press, the role of the press, Saad has already mentioned as crucial, of course, to a functioning democracy, a healthy, robust press that is able to push back. More and more under assault, even within Europe. Again, we see it in Poland, Hungary. We see it even in Austria and Slovenia. You are based in Berlin now, have been for many years. How are you viewing the process and the developments that you're seeing? How surprised are you?
You mean in terms of...
In Europe, yeah.
In Europe media?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, let me start with Turkey. In fact, we are not trusting media. We are fighting against the media now. That's the main problem, because I mean, this pro-government media turned into a propaganda machinery of the government. So it's really so hard to defend the truth under these circumstances, and it's almost all the media is controlled by the government at the moment. So this is a big problem. So a democracy without media, and a totalitarian regime with the media. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to reach our audience from afar now. And so we have, as you mentioned, we have a media outlet here, and now we have a new concept like exiled media. So, but it's not so easy, of course, to do that, because we are away from our reporters, we are away from our sources, and there's no enough infrastructure, and of course sponsorship is another problem. How can you finance your activities? And of course fake news is also a huge problem, and how can you cope with the governmental propaganda, and how can you fact check what you gather as the news? So it's not easy. I guess we are in a transitional period, so you cannot trust the governmental media, but at the same time, there's no alternative at the moment.
And in the absence of independent journalism, of course, John, let me follow up. The role of social media becomes more pertinent, Twitter as a tool, for instance, but it's a catch-22, isn't it? Social media can provide an outlet for people who are shut out, but it can also create all the pitfalls, fake news you pointed out.
Exactly.
And we know how social media, including Facebook, works. We know the business model. It depends on outrage. It feeds off hype, sensationalism, anger, fury, division. That's something that must be very concerning to you.
Exactly. Of course, I mean, in a way, this is the only mean we have at the moment, the social media, and we can only share our views via social media at the moment. But of course, it's so scary that, as you mentioned, hatred, racism, fake news is so easy to spread.
Saad, as a very experienced media man, social media, blessing or curse, it's not that easy, is it?
Well, when you read that Instagram contributes more to teen suicides, it's perhaps not a good thing. And
to democracy in particular.
And to democracy, and we've seen what Facebook has done, which I think is a very evil company. I'm sorry if they're one of your sponsors, but...
I don't think they are, but I don't know if we are being live streamed on Facebook right now. I don't know. Maybe they cut us off after this statement, but go right ahead.
But we use them, of course. We use Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and all the other social media outlets to amplify our programs and our messages. But the interesting thing in Afghanistan, it was a great experience, and probably we had this experience in Germany in the 50s and 60s. You have single TV households and families gather around, and so what we attempted to do was, intellectual humility is important for us. People have to get different points of view, and we tried to push for different points of view constantly, trying to balance things. So we had that opportunity, but unfortunately, Afghanistan will be where Germany is today in 10 years. A third of the country has access to smartphones, and that'll go up eventually to 80% or 90%. So, is it a losing battle? No, I don't think we should. People are still discerning. I think people know where to get their content. We just have to, and this has to start at schools. We have to educate our children, whether it's at home or at schools, to have this ability to look at different points of view and listen to different points of view and not be in a bubble of sorts, not in an echo chamber. But these are challenges that we all face.
Most definitely. We journalists certainly are not exempt from this by any means, Claudia. You're not a journalist per se, but it's certainly something that, as someone who evaluates democracy and the greater state of democracy on an international level, the role of media, the role of social media must be very much part of your discussion.
It is very much. I was actually reminded when my two colleagues talked. I grew up in Eastern Germany, and I remember that my father always said they rely on the whole newspaper So we start with the last page because on sport, there was sport on the last page, they can't lie. This shows that people very much realize when media is kind of controlled and not given the right picture. I think we always try to say this is good or bad, this is constraining or enabling, and I think it helps us a lot if we recognize that media, social media, and all kind of media will always be both. They will be constraining in that they kind of support totalitarian states and that they transport fake news and undermine democracies, but they can always be enabling too. And I remember right after 2014 and the very aggressive Russian foreign policy also toward the Baltic states, there was a big commitment in actually financing journalism in those countries and supporting the education of journalists in those countries as an enabling tool to constantly or better fight fake news. So I think I would totally agree with what you said. We need to invest into the education from the very early age on, so the next generation, so they can read media, understand information, and are better resilient, to come back to the initial lecture, have a better resilience against fake news. This is the one leg. And the other one is really investing in journalism, not only in the countries where it works halfway, but particularly in countries where it is difficult. So you always have to play this kind of enabling and constraining, or kind of understand both legs, and to really support the enabling dimension in various formats, from the education of the public up onto supporting journalism. There's another element which is often overseen, and this is if we look at, for example, the influence in think tanks, in academia from other countries. China is really trying to influence the discourse on China or the China narrative in Europe by threatening researchers openly, by opening questioning institute like Merrick's, by trying to be the kind of dominating voice on certain issues, like on the pandemic and the origin of the pandemic. So what we also should invest in, or where we should be careful, is the freedom of research, of academia, and to be sure who is financing what institute, who is financing what chair at what university or think tank. So that the freedom of research, of thinking, is as important as the freedom of press is something we really should invest in, because if you have an expert who just thinks in a certain direction, this will also shape the discourse.
Most definitely, and of course the topic of today's talk here, the totalitarian temptation, the erosion of democracy and democratic institutions. John, even here in Germany, you have segments here within the society. Germany is considered to be a very robust democracy, but at the end of the day, even here, you have segments within our society that think the press is part of the state. The term Lügenpresse, the lying press, has been coined by the AfD and spread by those who don't have trust in media being an independent source. How do we gain back the trust?
Well, first of all, we have to really fight against fake news, first of all. Then we should stick to our independence, because independence is the most crucial part of our business. If our readers feel a kind of dependence to any kind of government or any control by any business circles, that may destroy, our trustability. That's why being truthful and then being independent is so important. And of course, we should keep a distance to any political or economic power.
Saad, you are a man of all worlds, if I may say. Of course, you have a strong link to Australia, where you grew up. You lived in Dubai. You're based in London now. Obviously, you contributed greatly to media development in Afghanistan. If you look at the current state of press freedom, what comes to your mind?
Well, it's going to be it's a battle. We have to keep forging ahead, as John said. I think we have to, it takes you a decade to build your credibility, and overnight to have your reputation ruined with a bad story. And this is something we have to always be cognizant of. And getting viewers shouldn't necessarily be your aim, because you can amplify hate, xenophobia, and get a lot more viewers. So I think you have to always be very cognizant of that. And our news outlets are usually not, they're not really for-profit type businesses, unlike outlets like Fox News, for example, where they make a lot of money. As a matter of fact, our news outlets are subsidized. But I'm not sure what the answer to that is. You know, technology is changing every single day, and people are becoming, you know, we're dealing with, you know, with societies which are very much fragmented, and it's going to be difficult to appeal to these people. You know, they want to be in their own bubble, and they want their views, you know, echoed by someone else. You know, how do we win these people over? How do we bring them back to the middle? I mean, the German experience is a good one because you're not seeing the extremists prevail. The middle is still managing to come back, and that's a good sign.
It is a good sign indeed. For the time being, the status quo certainly is looking good compared to other countries. But Claudia, societies are fragmented, says Saad, and the media sometimes, John was saying, let's not associate one way or the other with governments. But if we look at the United States, particularly throughout the Trump years, it was very clear where CNN was coming from. It was very clear where Fox News was coming from. It was very clear where the New York Times was coming from. I mean, at the end of the day, it was almost two cheerleader camps battling each other. And that is not how you gain back trust. That is not how you exercise independent journalism, is it?
No, I mean, having such a strong polarization as we can observe it in the US, it's probably the best, not best, it's probably the best condition to have a democratic backslide. Because it's not so much about a topic or a content, it's us against them. And what we can see also in the kind of history or in the research is if you have societies that are extremely strongly polarized, it's a kind of good condition to actually reduce increasingly democratic basic rules. So actually keep a society where you can disagree in a cultivated manner and where you accept there's something in between the two opposites is key. And this is where I would agree that if you look at the German example, if you look at the elections we just had, we have a society where we don't have kind of two major political parties again, but we have the majority of the voters voted for a kind of political middle ground of strong democratic parties, which is good news. We normally say that the Americans or that the US is 10 years in advance and we get all the developments from the US 10 years later. I hope we don't. But that brings us back to the initial lecture of resilience. Or resiliency, one British football trainer once said it's bounce back ability. So to come back stronger, but I would add it's a learning process. So this proactive dimension that has been mentioned earlier, not only resist, but actually turn it into a positive energy. So keep our not so fragmented society, particularly keep the extremist ends low. And this is again where the media come in, because this is a crucial role to have this kind of broader spectrum of information, of opinion, and often, as I would call it, cultivated exchange, which is not against each other, but more with each other. So I hope this will not happen this 10 years. We will be in 10 years like the US.
Well, let's hope this is a trend, this is a US trend that will walk right past us. But the trend, John, and you were here throughout the pandemic, of course. The pandemic, when we talk about divisions, fragmentations, the pandemic in many ways have not brought us together, but I would argue has probably increased the fragmentation. Even within the media, some people I talked to on the street, they were saying, you know what, there's only one version that we're hearing. You know, we can't voice our contention to vaccines and so on and so forth. We're out there, we're being immediately branded Querdenker, you know, those people who think outside the box, which is not a compliment in this particular context. How do you see it? I mean, at the end of the day, for us, we have to inform. We have to inform, and especially throughout the pandemic, the eyes were on us for reliable information. But at the end of the day, the information that we provide is contested then, you know, by some segments of society. How did you experience this period here in Germany?
I'm afraid it's about trust first. We are losing our trust, I'm afraid. And the second thing is, I agree with Claudia in that sense. Polarization really is getting more dangerous in any sense, so it's part of it. and rumors are more trustable than the media in some cases. This is dangerous.
Why do you think we're losing that trust?
Well, many reasons, really. I mean, first, many people believe that the media is, a kind of tool for the big business, and they are helping some parties, some companies, whatever. So there's a huge belief in many minds. That's one thing. The other thing is there are really bad examples of media. I mean, I cannot say it for German media, but in many countries, really, we've been doing really badly. So there are enough reasons to, to see the erosion of the trust in media. I can say it for Turkey, for example, and many countries, really, if it's on media, then think twice. This is our slogan nowadays.
Saad, so we're losing trust, says John, that we as journalists, the profession, the institution is losing trust and therefore is not believed and therefore is leading to fragmentation, therefore is leading to the erosion of democracy and so on and so forth, this trickle-down effect that we are in. Why? What is your explanation for this?
Again, it gets back to intellectual humility. Unable to, dissenting voices are not tolerated. I mean, when the vaccine first emerged, someone said, well, it could have been developed in China, and then everyone went crazy. He said, no, you're a Trump supporter. And then if people are questioning whether the vaccine is good for them, and there's some of these concerns that people, I mean, I'm vaccinated, but people have genuine concerns, and they should be able to ask those questions. And rather than screaming at them, and I think people need to be able to explain to them. And I think, but often even if you look at the CDC, or if you look at Dr. Fauci, and if you look at their early statements, they were not being entirely truthful because they had no idea. And I think just not leveling with the American public made people very suspicious. Then it was politicized. One side said, you have to be vaccinated. The other side said, no. One side said it wasn't developed in China. The other side. So people took sides, including the media outlets. I mean, for me, the New York Times became difficult to read towards the end. CNN became impossible to watch. And you looked at their ratings since Biden's win. They've plummeted. Yeah. So Zucker realized early on that this is what he can do to take the other side. And they had record profits. So I think this is what we also have to be mindful of, is that there are other people, the media establishment, that is also responsible for creating this polarization, this fragmentation of our societies.
So you're basically saying that there is a lack of humility. There's perhaps even arrogance on the part of us, of journalists, in how we conduct our business.
On both sides. And I think people are not debating issues. We don't have proper debating programs. If you look at the 1960s and 70s in the US, that very famous conservative would get on television and would debate issues for like an hour and a half. So refreshing on CBS, prime time, 20 million viewers. We don't get those types of programs. And I think that, as much as we'd like to make money as a media outlet, I think we need to also have those types of programs where people can come and discuss and debate issues.
Sadly, this panel is slowly running its course. We're in the final stages already, Claudia. That's why I want to leave this audience with somewhat of a positive feeling, if we can. What is the silver lining out there? I mean, this is all doom and gloom that we've talked about, but it is the reality, of course. We cannot embellish the reality. We cannot deny or ignore it. But what is the silver lining when you get up in the morning? What gets you going? Where do you see signs for hopes that perhaps the tendencies, the totalitarian temptation, and the trend that has started in the US will decrease in times to come, and perhaps Francis Fukuyama will be right after all?
I think the one is time. Time for good developments and for bad developments is long. We could see how long it took Germany to change into a proper democratic country. And if we take the case of Afghanistan, but obviously not enough time for change really to take roots. So we could say we have now a very difficult moment when it comes to freedom of media, fake news and all that, but it's not lost. So if you think in longer timelines, we still have the time to actually, what we mentioned earlier, is invest in the education of the public, invest in good media, have good media standards, and actually try to put it in the right direction. So time can be negative, but time can also play in our favor. The other is that I think for a very long time we were a bit complacent and considered that things how they are in our country are good. And I think this crisis, in the best case, leads to catharsis. So it helps us to see things differently. And my impression is that over the last years, we realized, or we recognized that democracy has become a critical infrastructure which we need to protect as much as our energy grids and other things. And if we consider democracy being a critical infrastructure that we need to protect, it's not given, then we can deduce or take conclusions in many areas. And one is freedom of media, it's education, it's refusing that our public opinion and research is undermined by other countries, do a screening not only of economics, to look for China or Russia influence, but also look at the media and also look at the academia. So I think there is an awareness process. And you mentioned the pandemic before. The pandemic was to a certain extent first a crisis. The first reaction to the pandemic was all countries inward looking, to my nation state. They forgot about Europe. Interestingly enough, the second stage was the launch of the Recovery Fund, which was a progress in economic cooperation which we had never thought possible. So I think to be a little bit optimistic. I think the little hope was obviously if you look at the German case again, the strong commitment or the strong turnout in the elections, which shows me there is some hope, there is some interest. And if I would finish on the more personal note, I think that people who have lived in an authoritarian or totalitarian state, which at least applies to two on the panel, value democracy even more. And that gives also resilience and power. And I think that those countries or people who can choose would probably choose in one direction, so we have to strengthen them. And this comes back to the media. So I give homework to all of you.
Well, homework that is probably well taken. John, same question to you. You've been here for a number of years now, for obvious reasons that we know of. What gives you still hope? What makes you optimistic that democracy, not just in your country, but all across this globe, even in Europe, will prevail, that democracy, for lack of a better term, will become sexy again, will become the source people will look towards?
I guess we learned a lot from the pandemic process. Social states, importance of education, trustable media, functioning government, environment issues, importance of international solidarity. So those concepts will be around with us in the coming decade. And we have a post-Trump administration in US, which is important, I guess. And a social tendency, you can see that social democrats coming to power, for example, in Germany, after the United States. So, I mean, I guess those issues will be more on the agenda in the coming years. That's why, in that sense, I'm optimistic. Hopefully we can use this, what we learned from this really last 2 years. It was really traumatic. For Turkey, I'm also optimistic that we are coming to an end of this really dark period of time. Because even there we learned that politics and Islam cannot be, live together. So this should be separated, and the religion should be separated from politics. And now we can see that the opposition alliance is getting more power, and hopefully in the coming elections, which are expected next year, we will have another kind of democratic alliance in the power of Turkey.
And I suppose one of the lessons we've all learned is how fragile democracy is, no, John? That we cannot take it for granted. It's a daily work.
Exactly, that's so important. We learned it. I mean, it's more like it didn't happen one night, but it was like the boiling frog experiment. So it took years, and they came step by step. But one last thing is important. I mean, Germany could be a democratic country within itself, but it should support democratic forces all over the world. I mean, you cannot just shut your door and keep your democracy alive, but you should support the other democratic forces in the other countries. Otherwise, I mean, this is like pollution. You cannot, you know, have democracy within at home, but if democracy does not exist anymore around, you cannot just be safe.
Something that is, Claudia, increasingly difficult for Germany. Of course, we see it within the European Union to get through to those leaders in Hungary, Poland, and Slovenia. It is an uphill task for sure, but something that the new administration, and perhaps the gentleman whom we will see here later up on stage will be part of, has their work cut out for themselves. Saad, I want to end with you. Obviously, the Taliban ruled your country from 96 to 2001. Now they're back in power. We've been talking about erosion of democracy. We've talked about values and so on and so forth. Some people are offering the thesis that we might see a Taliban 2.0, that perhaps this will not be the repeat of the 90s. You obviously know them, you have talked to them. What is your sense?
It's difficult to tell because there are different competing wings within the Taliban movement. They don't have the single leader that they did in the 90s. And they don't all agree. They have a constituency that's very hardcore. This constituency sent out young boys to kill themselves, to blow themselves up, so they will have their own demands. But if they don't broaden their base, it's going to be difficult for them to govern this nation that's doubled in size over the last 20 years, from 21 million to 38 million people. So the jury's out. I'm usually hopeful, but I'd say it's a 50-50 thing. And sadly, what happens in Afghanistan is not going to stay in Afghanistan. A dictatorial Khmer Rouge type regime will force millions of people to flee the country. And Afghanistan is 2 countries away from Europe. Iran, Turkey, and Europe. And if the Europeans care about Afghanistan, or not wanting to see a lot of refugees, they have to engage in what's transpiring in Afghanistan. Democracy is...
What's your advice to those countries? What can they do?
My advice is to engage with the Taliban, to be engaged in the region, to go in there and not recognize them, it's a totally different thing, but to engage with this regime, because I think that otherwise they will go, their default mode is a Khmer Rouge type regime that you will see emerge in the country. Well, you see genocide and ethnic cleansing, mass starvation of people. The way our economy is going right now, 90% of the population is going to be under the poverty line. So it's got difficult days ahead, but the world needs to engage. And I totally agree with John that democracy is not something just for you. I think it's going to benefit the globe. It has to be championed, maybe not imposed in the way it was in Iraq and Afghanistan. We can learn some lessons there. But to your point, actually, just getting back to social media, I think the world has to learn to regulate social media platforms. I mean, fake news in particular, but it's just the way that kids are being, brainwashed. Kids are being forced to not eat food or commit suicide. I mean, we regulate alcohol companies, we regulate cigarette companies, why not social media outlets? And the other idea is, I think something like in Britain with Ofcom, programs need to be balanced. And I think it's important for the government to step in order to protect democracy longer term.
Claudia, you wanted to jump in before you wrap up?
Because I think it's a really important point both made, is that particularly being in Germany, we have the tendency to think what happens outside somehow doesn't really concern us. And I totally agree with that. We have to be more engaged or take care or engage for helping or supporting other countries' democracies, because what happens outside Germany, outside Europe, comes back to Germany. And for a long time, my country somehow pretended that we can be like a big Switzerland and just hide away and leave all those dirty, difficult jobs to the US, UK, maybe a little bit of France. And what we increasingly realized, for example, with immigration in 2015, that problems arrive at our doorstep and in our backyard. And this actually requires us, Germany, to recognize far more how international interlinked we are. Our prosperity, our stability, our peace depends on the stability and peace and prosperity of the outside world and order. And if we want to benefit from that economically and politically, we have to get engaged outside. And this might include, at some point, also using military means, which we don't like to talk about. So the question is actually, if we want to benefit, if we want to support democracy, because democracies tend to not do war, and if we want to support that stability from which we benefit, we need to be far more outward-looking, and we cannot just say, that's so difficult, international orders going down, all is falling apart, China is difficult, we don't do anything, because things arrive in Germany. And I think this is probably the most important lesson. We have a responsibility for what's happening outside.
Pretty much echoing, Saad, what you're saying, we Germans / Europeans perhaps, we need to be engaged. We need not take our eyes off the ball, in essence,
and sometimes you have to lead. It's time for Germany to, to sometimes lead some of these efforts. You're a big country. You're leading powerhouse, economic powerhouse. It's time for Germany to step up, especially in places like Afghanistan or in Turkey, where it has such a good reputation.
Well, Germany has to lead. I know that's a panel in and of itself that we could lead here. And as I said, we're going to have Christian Lindner soon with us here, who most probably will be part of the next administration. It's something we can put towards him. Last question, Saad, before we go. Right now, all the attention, or most of the attention of the international community is on Afghanistan. But you know how this business works. Today's Afghanistan, tomorrow is COVID, then it's another election, and before you know it, it's the World Cup, and nobody cares anymore. How concerned are you that Afghanistan will disappear, for lack of a better term, from the headlines and from the attention span of countries like Germany and the West?
It will not be on the front pages, but it'll come back. Refugees, drugs, terrorism, if the world disengages. And starving Afghans will make it back to the front pages. So I think, but yeah, there is that concern. The world wants it to walk away from it, as is, usually the case with anything that resembles a disaster. People in the US administration probably would want to forget Afghanistan. But I think, as I said, what happens in Afghanistan will not necessarily stay in Afghanistan.
I think that's for certain. It will affect Germany, it will affect Turkey. John, this is already, Afghanistan is very much also in the headlines of the Turkish discourse. Be that as it may, the totalitarian temptation, the state of democracy and the rise of totalitarianism. It's a big issue, of course, cannot be sufficiently covered in all aspects within the 45 minutes, but I think I speak for all here in the audience when I say this has been a fascinating discussion from 3 individuals who are very much at the forefront of shaping this debate. Thank you so much for your food for thought that you have given us, and we wish you the best of luck in your future endeavors, to all countries being involved, and perhaps for a new government stepping up and exerting that leadership that Claudia Major was talking about. Can Dündar, Claudia Major, Saad Mohseni, this is your applause. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back here, both physically in Potsdam and everybody joining us online for truly a highlight every year of the M100 Colloquium, namely the M100 Media Award. M100, of course, one of the most prestigious media conferences all across Europe, has been in existence since 2005, and since 2005 it has recognized those who are at the forefront of fighting for a democracy, particularly in the field of the press. And we couldn't be more delighted since 2005 to be hosted by this beautiful city in this beautiful venue, namely in Potsdam. Potsdam and M100, two segments, two terms that cannot be separated. They go hand in hand. M100 is very much ingrained in the DNA of Potsdam. Therefore, it is my great delight and pleasure to kick off the M100 Media Part now, to welcome on stage the mayor of Potsdam. Delighted to have him with us, ladies and gentlemen. Please welcome Mayor Mike Schubert.
Sehr geehrter Herr Volkov,
Mr. Volkov, Mr. Reckwitz, Mr. Lindner, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, it is great to see all of you here again because of the pandemic, we unfortunately only had a small M100 variant last year. So I would therefore like to extend a warm welcome to you in the capital state of Potsdam. I'm delighted that you, Mr. Lindner, have joined us today, despite the special situation in Berlin, to give the laudatory speech for Alexei Navalny. I must admit that I'm very curious about your speech on this year's prize winner, as it will be delivered by a man who could very likely be a member of the new German government in a few weeks' time. I think I can claim that. Thus, for me, your statement today is also a pointer to how one of the future governing parties will position itself between the freedom of opinion and the associated individual freedom of a political dissident, and the nevertheless necessary geopolitical need for language and rapprochement with Russia. Ladies and gentlemen, this year, M100 has dedicated itself to the topic From Crisis in Perpetuity to Democratic Resilience. This topic certainly builds primarily, but not only, on the events of the last year. To hear of a pandemic that is kind of unique and has never been seen in our modern world before. But democratic resilience, as Mr. Reckwitz earlier said, hasn't just mattered since the COVID pandemic. In an increasingly individualized society, the question of reinforcing the value of community now more than ever matters again if we are not to watch our society atomize into a horde of individuals. For me, democratic resilience is the ability of a community in situations of social and political crisis and transformation to repeatedly achieve an acceptance of democracy as a form of society, a form of state, and a form of life that is supported by the majority of society and legitimized in the democratic debate, and to defend this fundamental value of a pluralistic society. And yes, for me, defending these fundamental values is also part of this. For with all the plurality of opinions, tolerance must find its limit in the defense against statements that are anti-human and anti-democratic. The prerequisite of a democratic community is the protection of human and fundamental rights and the affirmation of democracy as a form of society. And I think all powers must make their contribution to this. Ladies and gentlemen, you have spoken at length today about your views on democratic resilience and the role of European media in strengthening it. If you, as a German politician, deal with media and their effects, or look for examples, then you would be well advised to look beyond the domestic publications first. One could step on the foot of one or the other, and who wants that as a policymaker in a media society? And this is why I want to make a first example as kind of a warm-up on an article from an Austrian newspaper. The member of our board, Christian Lindner, has pondered in his last editorial in the Austrian magazine Prof about the statement, "If we still know what we are voting for." Well, dear Christian Lindner, you are watching us. I at least remember what and why I voted for him. But I admit that my election decision-making might indeed be very different from many others. But Christian Lindner describes in his article a danger for democratic resilience, where pluralism and substantive differentiation of the parties as a criterion are gradually getting lost. Space is created for decisions that are based more on the human qualities of the candidates, or at least those that the respective campaigns want to suggest to us. But the question that arises at a media congress is the role of the media. So what do the media and the form of their reporting contribute to these people being elected? Let me start with a hypothesis. The attention economy of today's media business, and we have heard it already earlier in Mr. Reckwitz's presentation, is a perfect breeding ground for the emergence and symbiosis of populist sentiments and the personalization of politics. The pointed thesis presented by a politician type agent provocateur is what makes headlines. Politicians only become interesting for the media when they can be ascribed the label of provocative lateral thinker, taboo breaker, rabble rouser. Boris Palmer, my colleague in the corona pandemic, is a good example of this. The opposing side are the politicians whose statements are more difficult to condense into loud sentences. If, in the course of a political life, one is no longer prepared to permanently break taboos, media interest also cools down sometimes. So there is a permanent dependence between provocation and headline. The media and policymakers thus become symbiotic partners, because there are you, the media populists, who think they are giving expression to the real concerns of ordinary people, which would no longer be adequately addressed in an allegedly detached political establishment. Now, does this form of reporting contribute to democratic resilience? Often one could argue about this, but on one issue, from my point of view, it does not. There has been one issue in the past 6 years for which political and media populism has been a poison, challenging democratic resilience and our common European canon of fundamental rights. On no issue has there been such a populist pointed argument in recent years, including by representatives of so-called established parties, as on refugee policy. Let me give you an example. For me personally, one of the low points was a statement by the Austrian Chancellor, Sebastian Kurz, in the Bild newspaper in January 2020. The headline read, "Private sea rescue leads to more deaths." Sea rescue leads to more deaths, period. Well, I personally do not think much of letting people drown in order to deter others, because that is, in fact, the reverse of the statement. We do not save for the time being because if some people are not saved, others will not follow. This is wrong, cynical, and inhumane. Lest I be misunderstood here, it is just as wrong and unacceptable for the Chancellor to then be called an eco-fascist or baby Hitler in the reaction of sea rescuers. If we want humanity in Europe, then it starts with language. Otherwise, we will end up with a populist front, which will certainly not enable citizens to form their own opinions on the basis of facts. But what would have been my very personal, one might think I'm naive, expectation of a newspaper? At least to refer the Austrian Chancellor to international maritime law, and maybe even perhaps to Article 18 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU, which initiates the right to asylum, and to confront him with a deviating attitude, perhaps with the question of whether he would already know at the time of the rescue if whether it is a person who has no right to asylum. I want to try myself as a headliner. Scandal: Austrian Chancellor wants to let people drown in the Mediterranean, or Austrian Chancellor calls for breach of European law. Would have been an eye-catcher too, I'm sure, but it would, I agree, have contributed just as little to the solution. Ladies and gentlemen, the history of Potsdam, the city you are visiting today, is a history of openness, tolerance, and migration. Tolerance and migration have opened up opportunities for Potsdam and have been the engine behind our development. And it is in this tradition of togetherness and dealing with immigration that the city continues to act today. At the beginning of 2019, the German Cities of Safe Havens Alliance was founded in Potsdam with 13 members. Today, we are over 100 members, close 18 million people. In the meantime, the alliance is now growing on a European level. 35 cities signed a declaration to this effect at the invitation of Potsdam and Palermo. All these cities have democratically legitimized their decision, by the way, many of them through resolutions of their councils. City councils, that is. But here, too, there is an example of media that consciously or unconsciously at least disparage the democratic decision through linguistic exaggeration. There are many examples, but let me pick out one. In a commentary for Spiegel Online, Nikolaus Blome equated cities that offer their own refugee reception with bill collectors from his student days, because these cities sort of virtually order refugees, but do not pay the entire bill or costs. Sorry, but such a statement mocks the work of many people in the area of integration, reduces the constitutional right to asylum to a monetary aspect. The question is one fundamental right of our constitution worth less than the other? Or may it be scorned just because it costs money? Again, my question, do such statements lead to democratic resilience? What we need instead of permanent aggravation on this issue, and in my opinion this applies not only to policymakers but also to journalists, is the search for an implementable consensus. Implementable consensus does not mean that we can receive everybody in the long term. It's about a moral pragmatism to bring large parts of our society together again. It's about winning back those or giving a voice to those who are sort of between the fronts of the populace, those who feel that they are hardly being heard in the current political debates, not because they shout loudly and no one listens to them, but because they don't feel they belong to either of the loud fringes, but are the center of society. Those who want to see themselves neither as citizens of the world nor as nationalists. But this also requires differentiated reporting. And there's no law that forces politicians or journalists to be populist. There are citizens all over Europe who see sea rescue first and foremost as a humanitarian duty, but for whom the question of a fair distribution of tasks, organized procedures, and social integration in the refugee issue are important. People, by the way, who at the same time do not want the European external borders to be called into question. And they want to see the external borders protected. And I'm saying this consciously on days where we see an escalation in Belarus, unparalleled in the Eastern European area. The fact that there is a way and the will of many cities to do this is currently not being taken into account in the polarized debate in the media on the issue of migration. In the future, we need a discussion about the necessity of immigration that is free of populism. In the coming years, we will have to master major challenges in Europe: demographic change and a shortage of skilled labor. Can this be done at all without immigration? I wish, and with this, I have a wish as chairman of the M100 Advisory Board to the media. Please inform people more about possible lines of compromise. Build up pressure on policymakers to seek compromises. Create echo chambers for a dialogue that creates a climate in society that contributes to ending the European stalemate on refugee policy. Dictators that deprive dictators to use refugees as a weapon. We must not continue to omit and exacerbate this issue that is toxic for our social cohesion. We need a strong, credible, debatable, and strong democracy. Because only if it is strong, credible, willing to discuss and defend itself, it is also resilient. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Potsdam Mayor Mike Schubert for your remarks, for kicking off the M100 Media Award, and for your strong words and appeal even to press people, to the experienced people joining us online or here in the audience, of perhaps treating and covering the very delicate political issue of migration and refugees in a more responsible manner, a topic that has come up during our special talk earlier today. Mark Schubert also mentioned that the M100 colloquium already started quite early today with 3 parallel strategic roundtable discussions. And before we move on, I want to take a second to recognize those who've led those discussions. The first one was focusing on leaderships in post-COVID times. It was led by the journalist and filmmaker Annalisa Piras. Let's give her a hand. Thank you so much for this. The second one, a very important one, something that the mayors already alluded to, fit for the job, Europe's role in a new world order. Christian Lindner, the role of German leadership came up quite a bit during our previous special talk. That very important working group was led by M100 board member Christoph Lanz. Let's give him a hand. Thank you so much. And last but certainly not least, another issue we talked about here on stage, namely trust in journalism, a matter of facts, trust, science and journalism in times of a pandemic, a very pertinent, crucial and timely issue. It's not going to go away anytime soon. That one was led by none other than the Economist's own Anne McElvoy. Thank you so much, Anne. That's your applause. Thank you. Now, Mike Schubert the mayor has already pointed out whom the M100 Media Award is going to be assigned to this year, none other than, of course, the Russian activist Alexei Navalny. To get more familiar with his work and his struggle, let's have a quick look.
Привет, это Навальный. И это расследование мы придумали еще, когда я находился в реанимации. Но сразу договорились о том, что выпустим мы его только когда я вернусь домой, в Россию, в Москву, потому что мы не хотим, чтобы главный герой этого фильма думал о том, что мы его боимся, и что я буду рассказывать о его самом страшном секрете, находясь за границей.
Mr. Putin realized that it's not affordable for his system to give people more democracy. That's why in the 2012 he completely changed his strategy and start to arrest people, start to fabricate criminal cases. Look, in the start of the 2011, I was a respectful lawyer. At the end of the 2012, I was several-time convict.
Is it, in your mind, worth your life? Because there is a big target on you, no question.
I'm trying to not to think about it because, look, I think I'm ready to sacrifice everything for my job and for the people who are surrounding me. I'm not let them down. And I'm trying to not to reflect about it all the time.
One of the most prominent, if not the most prominent voice in Russia these days for democracy, Alexei Navalny. We're very delighted. We're very delighted to have with us a gentleman who's quite busy these days, no doubt, and trying to form the next German government and play undoubtedly a very crucial part in it. Nonetheless, he didn't want to pass up the opportunity to come to Potsdam today and hand over the prize himself. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to the head of the Free Democratic Party, FDP, Mr. Christian Lindner.
Lieber Herr Volkov,
Mr. Volkov, Lord Mayor Schubert, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished audience. The M100 Media Award is awarded to personalities that are engaging for democracy, European understanding, and the freedom of the press and media. After 2018, it is a great honor for me to, for the second time, be invited to speak on the occasion of an award ceremony. The award winner of 2018, Denis Yücel, and today's award winner, Alexei Navalny, certainly also have many things in common. Both are connected by the fact that they were politically motivated or detained with political motivation, and one in Russia, the other one in Turkey. But this is not this political fate that is connecting them and for which they are deserving attention. It is their democratic action they are honored for. Before we honor Alexei Navalny, let me just briefly point out to you that this award ceremony solely constitutes a platform of a conspiracy of the West to finance the organization of Navalny's that is engaging in this, because this is what I had to read on the news page of a Russian troll factory. And even I myself am playing a role there, because I found out that Alexei Navalny is a lever for me. This is what a political scientist is saying. It is a lever for me, a springboard into the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and especially bad are the colleagues from Alliance 90, the Greens. Navalny is only their means in the ideological battle against the pipeline Nord Stream 2. When it comes to the springboard into the German Federal Foreign Ministry, I can tell you that looking into German quality journalism, it becomes clear to you that we have different plans in mind. But this shows how indispensable the fight against disinformation is. So it could be advisable that the international independent quality journalism in Russian language would also have to be financed by the public institutions in the future a little bit more. Unfortunately, the award cannot be accepted in person by Alexei Navalny because he is detained to the east of Moscow at this very minute because he dared to speak out when it came to corruption and other public failures. He also said, "I am detained because I dared to survive an attack on myself." On a weekly basis, I am informing about the detention of Alexei Navalny, more than 236 days of detention in the meantime. So I am informing about this on Twitter, just as I'm informing about the fact that this is not based on any legal basis, as was ruled by the European Court of Human Rights. So we have the responsibility to not forget about opposition leaders or representatives in authoritarian states. Alexei Navalny, long before 2020, had been an anti-corruption activist with his foundation. Also, as a Russian opposition policy maker, he was second in the race when it came to the elections for the Russian Moscow mayoral elections. But he became a global symbol of the fight of democracy and freedom on the 20th of August 2020, when on a flight from Tomsk to Moscow, he was poisoned with a toxic agent. He then was brought to Germany and, urged by his family, he was treated in the Charité Hospital in Berlin, and his life was saved. It was not the first attack on his life, because we saw his video where he showed his green-colored face when, after the electoral campaign and during the electoral campaign in 2018, he was attacked with a bag of paint, and not even his name was admitted to the electoral ballot. He recovered in Germany. I met him towards the end of 2020, and this is when we had an exchange together with his wife. He has a family. And then in January, we found out that he has the intention to return to Moscow. And I remember very well the feelings I had when I heard the news from him. He knew what he had to expect, and for sure, he knew that he would stand a trial that would not live up to the standards for legal procedure that we have over here. But regardless, he opted for this because he knew that his role and responsibility as an opposition representative would be undermined if he remained in the West. What a price to pay by this hero of the democratic struggle, and he is willing to pay this. In Germany, sometimes we complain about restrictions of our personal freedoms, and I'm not talking about the limitations of our individual freedoms during the pandemic. But there are other studies that tell us that Germans believe that their freedom of opinion is restricted. And yes, also with us, sometimes there is a discussion on opinion pluralism that is happening in the publicized public opinion. But how little do our complaints seem in view of repression that is exercised in an authoritarian regime like Russia? And what a price Alexei Navalny is ready to pay. Everything for the family, everything for everyone who is associated with him, for his organization, which deepest respect we have to pay him for this. So while he is detained at this very hour, there are more legal procedures ongoing. Further, activists of your foundation are also the target. In the course of this year, it was also now categorized as being extremist, and also foreign political foundations are suffering from repression, those that are fighting for democracy and human rights. But Alexei Navalny remains courageous. He makes jokes on Instagram. He says, "Don't worry about me, because 30 years is the limit for life imprisonment in Russia. So 2041 is the day of my release, or the year of my release." So humor can also be a weapon. The detention and the trials that are brought again and again against him and his organization are not acceptable internationally. Public and political pressure needs to be maintained, and an attack on somebody's life is a break of civilization, a breach of civilization. And this is why I believe that this way of handling opposition and criticism is an expression of those in power themselves. So whoever is dealing with opposition representatives in that way is showing something about his or her own felt legitimacy and strength, or the non-existence of this inner strength and legitimacy. In January 2020, together with a delegation, I traveled to Moscow. There we stood on a bridge and we could see the Kremlin, and we stood precisely at this place where Boris Nemtsov on the 27th of February 2015 was shot down in a cold-blooded way. He also was a face of the Russian opposition. Before, he also was one of the architects of market economy reforms in Russia in the 1990s. So just after Alexei Navalny on the 20th of August 2020 was poisoned in Germany, in Berlin, I met Vladimir Karamurza, a former advisor to Boris Nemtsov, and he was also poisoned twice, 2015 and 2017. And together with him, we had an exchange. We discussed what can be done. What is it that you expect? Two things, he said. For one, please make people aware of our situation. Don't forget us. Support us with publicity. And he also gave us a second inspiration, food for thought. And in October 2020, I also discussed this with Alexei Navalny. He said the biggest pressure on an autocratic regime is built up when a sanction mechanism is not created against the population, but against those who are responsible for the violation of civil and human rights. So human rights violations and corruption should be punished with personalized sanctions that do not forcibly have to hit the civilian population, and this can then also be the reason for those in power to direct their propaganda against democratic communities. Magnitsky Acts, I believe, are correct, also not least as in response to the poisoning of Alexei Navalny. These should be established and further pursued in our country and also at the European level. These are individual sanction mechanisms vis-à-vis those that are in charge in authoritarian regimes and that are responsible for international law violations or human rights violations. Since December 2020, a global human rights sanction regime has been established, and this was introduced at the European level. First sanctions were already introduced in the context of the detention and prosecution of Alexei Navalny and the suppression of peaceful protests against 4 Russian representatives. And this can only be a start. So we have to be tough on illegitimate power and corrupt elites everywhere in this world. And at the same time, we need to open our hearts towards a population that is longing for a good future. The disclosure video on the corruption events in the surroundings of Vladimir Putin was seen by 120 million people on YouTube. After his return to Russia, Alexei Navalny published this, and it was important for him to show this. He said, "I return to my home country that I had to leave involuntarily and in a coma. I am not afraid. I have no fear to speak the truth." So together with his team, he continues his work even under the most unpleasant conditions, even in exile, like Leonid Volkov, who today is going to accept this award on his behalf as the Chief of Staff and Political Director of the team. He possibly is responsible for the biggest project of a future democratic Russia, that is smart voting. It has the central idea to bundle, to join up forces in political opposition so that the most promising political candidates can be agreed on, and by this, the opposition at large is strengthened. Ladies and gentlemen, I am convinced that with these measures, together with others, and with a courage like the one of Alexei Navalny and his fellow activists, have shown the change of power, the change of statehood from the inside is possible. Alexei Navalny himself says, "Fight for your democratic rights and be brave." And I am convinced that the fight for freedom in the long run is stronger than power and oppression. For liberal democracies, democratic opposition everywhere in this world should be a natural partner, not only in Russia, but also the interests of the population in Hong Kong should be taken just as seriously, and we should not forget the situation in Belarus either. So, together with this opposition worldwide, we share the fundamental values of democracy, the rule of law, and freedom. Germany and Europe need a foreign policy that, in a wise manner, represents interests in the field of dialogue, exchange, and trade, and that combines these interests with our indispensable values that we will not forgo. In our societies, we can only fight for the liberal foundation of our democratic societies when we stick to these values. Once they are contradicted or are contradicting other interests we might have. This is why I congratulate Alexei Navalny on this award. And Leonid, to you, let me show you my respect. And I believe we're all responsible to do alike when it comes to fighting for freedom in this world, just like you do. Thank you very much.
Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, Herr
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Schubert, Mr. Lindner, thank you very much. Now I'm going to switch to English.
It is my great honor to be with you here tonight and accept the M100 Media Award on behalf of Alexei Navalny and the Anti-Corruption Foundation. Frankly, these days there are quite a few similar ceremonies being held to mark Alexei Navalny's crush and achievements. I just came from Warsaw this morning, where yesterday they awarded Alexei Navalny with a Knight of Freedom distinction. The prize was a sword, and I only travel with cabin luggage. A good thing to defeat Putin, probably, when you come close to him. And all of this is, of course, by all means, well deserved by Alexei. Since August 2020, his story became well known to the world, as it has demonstrated how real life, even during the COVID times, could be more thrilling than any Netflix showrunners could imagine. A story about him being poisoned and able to survive, the story about him investigating the murder attempt against himself and being able to identify the assassins, the story of his return to Russia after having produced a masterpiece investigation about Putin's enormous wealth, well, that definitely deserves to be appreciated. But still, this very award stands out, as it is of very special meaning for us, and I'd like to try to explain why. There are two basic reasons for that. First, the M100 Media Award, unlike others, is presented not only to Alexei Navalny, but, as it is written here, both to Alexei Navalny and to the Anti-Corruption Foundation that he founded back in 2011. So it puts a very important accent on the fact that Alexei Navalny was not and is not alone. He's not a lonely voice in an ocean of silence, like, for instance, the Soviet dissidents of the 60s were. Quite contrary, he is a man who managed to build a large political organization in a very innovative and creative manner, navigating Russia's bumpy media and political landscape. He used the internet, the social media, to reach out to people all across our huge country, to break the silence, to counter both the most blatant and outright lies, and to counter the soft power of the propaganda. And of course, he is a very courageous man, but courage alone would not be enough to bring us where we are now. It was hard work, above all. The organization that I represent, the organization he's built, has proven to be a very capable one, an organization that persists, even while he is in prison. In fact, this year, we produced more investigations, reached more viewers and readers than in any of all the previous years. Despite all those challenging circumstances, being pushed out of the country, being labeled extremists, just like Al-Qaeda, being accused of all possible sins. There are 7 criminal charges in Russia against myself. So in fact, there could be quite a reward, if just in case someone is interested. So despite all of the above, we continue to work, and with a lot of success, due to the new media, which made it possible. So I'm very proud to accept the M100 Media Award, not only on Alexei's behalf, but on behalf of the whole team, which is several hundred young, mostly young, people not only in Moscow, but from all Russia's 11 time zones, from Kaliningrad to Vladivostok, who were campaigning for Alexei and with Alexei, who were running for local elections, supporting local activism in their cities, investigating their local thieves and crooks. They did it being inspired by Alexei Navalny, and they continue. We continue. We are not defeated. In fact, we are sure as never before that we will overcome this. And then there is a second important thing, which comes along with this award only. This is a press prize. awarded for journalism. Alexei Navalny is a politician who was running for mayor of Moscow and for president of Russia. Well, never did on the ballot, but still. He is a freedom fighter who was poisoned and jailed. He's a party leader who has built a strong political force, which just won over 100 seats in regional elections. But indeed, his main lifetime achievement, the Anti-Corruption Foundation, is first of all about investigative journalism. This is through this journalism, through written and spoken word, through telling stories, Alexei Navalny became who he is, Putin's main rival and enemy of the state #1. And he actually now shares the fate of so many journalists all over the world being prosecuted for telling the truth. The Russian state has also awarded us with many distinctions. Foreign agents, extremists, criminals. And, well, you know, after the Anti-Corruption Foundation was labeled an extremist organization in Russia, we had to formally dissolve it. Otherwise, our employees would risk up to 10 years in prison just for being our employees, receiving salary and paying taxes. So, technically, that part of the award, which consists of 2 parts, that goes to the Anti-Corruption Foundation is the posthumous one, a post-mortem one. Putin very much wanted both parts to become post-mortem. Luckily, he failed. Anti-Corruption Foundation, 2011-2021. So could the gravestone look like. But what else should be written on it? What is the foundation's most important legacy? And I would say this was that the organization, I would say this legacy is that our organization has changed Russia through education and enlightenment, which is another so important, albeit often forgotten aspect of journalism. When we launched the foundation back in 2011, only around 15% of Russian voters, according to independent polls, considered corruption to be a major political issue. Now, 10 years later, and hundreds of millions of views of our videos later, this figure stands above 60%. So from 15 to 60, a truly tectonic change for the whole Russian society. It required patience. It required time and persistence. People often ask it, and they keep asking, why yet another investigation? Another palace, another luxury yacht, another private jet of another modest deputy prime minister, or deputy minister even. Wasn't it already enough? We already know they are all corrupt. What does a new investigation add? But it reaches new people, new audiences. And we carry it on. And we will continue, of course. And this changes the society in Russia. And there is one more very important thing that our investigations revealed. Over the course of these 10 years of our history, we have proven beyond reasonable doubt corruption is a human rights issue, probably the most vital of all of them. When the leadership of the country is totally corrupt, which is unfortunately the case in Russia, there is no choice for them but to rig the elections, as they just can't afford to get outvoted. There is no choice for them but to destroy the judicial system, as they just can't afford to be challenged in courts over their crimes. There is no choice for them but to beat down the protests, just like they do, as otherwise they would lose their ability to steal more money. And you know, children are growing and so on. And there is always a larger yacht. And there is no choice for them but to erase freedom of press and freedom of speech, as they just can't afford their corruption to be spoken about. All of this has happened in Russia, and this is happening in so many other countries all around the world. So the fight for the human rights should begin as a fight against corruption. This has been proven by Alexei Navalny and the Anti-Corruption Foundation. And that's why we feel it so important for us that our anti-corruption work is recognized in Europe. It is important for a very practical reason, as we continue our anti-corruption work, as the fight against corruption is a global fight, And we can't win this fight alone. As long as those people, Putin's friends, will be able to use stolen money to buy villas in Côte d'Azur, to build their yachts by Lawson in Bremen, to send their children to the best private schools in the UK, they will not stop. And unfortunately, this is the situation. So if someone with a Russian passport wants to open a bank account somewhere in the EU, in Germany, millions of questions will be asked, and at the end of the day, there will be a refusal, because banks just don't want to do something with this and with some small amount of money. But if someone comes with 100 million euro in cash, the attitude becomes very much different. And there are always solutions and decisions and ways around, just like Pandora Papers very recently demonstrated. So this money of Putin and his friends, covered with blood and Novichok, that's all here, all around us, here in Europe. It's not only spent on luxury properties, but also on Western politicians. It is buying influence, and it is also buying media. So actually, we don't ask Europe to help us. We do ask Europe to help itself. Dirty money from Russia and countries alike spoil and rot the very foundations of the political system of the free society. It's just getting too dangerous. Europe has to help itself, but by doing so, of course, it will also help us a lot, making corruption in Russia less enjoyable and also becoming more of a role model for those within Russia who fight for change and for a better future for our country. We believe in European future for Russia. We consider this award to be a clear indication that we are on track to bring Russia back to Europe, where it belongs. It will require time, a lot of time, hard work, a lot of patience, but at the end of the day, we shall overcome. Thank you so much.
Indeed, well-deserved. Congratulations, Leonid Volkov, for this prize. I believe it'll be easier to check in at the airport than the sword you got in Poland yesterday. Wonderful to have you with us today. Thank you so much also, of course, as always, to Mike Schubert and the city of Potsdam for hosting M100, and a special thanks to Christian Lindner, who took the time, despite this very critical juncture, not just for his party, but the whole nation, to be here in Potsdam to convey his greetings, his wishes, and the prize to Alexei Navalny. Please. Ladies and gentlemen, this wraps up the 2021 edition of the M100 SANSSOUCI Colloquium. I can tell you it's wonderful. It was wonderful to be back here in person again, a tradition that hopefully we will continue from here on uninterrupted. It was a lovely evening, very inspiring, as always, seeing everyone. But also, thank you for joining us online, of course, for everyone who has joined us, who's followed the discussion throughout today and this evening. With that, I'm Aslan. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope to see you again in 2022 when M100 will be back. All the best. Until then, cheers.